With Sass, we're able to nest selectors in the same visual hierarchy of our HTML. So now we're going to look for areas where it makes sense to nest Sass rules. Now, a common misconception a lot of us just starting out with Sass may have is that we must nest all the things, right? So for example, and this is just an example, we might create a rule like this. So let's say secondary content. Then inside secondary content, we'll nest another rule. So let's say resorts. Then inside resorts, we'll nest another rule. So let's say UL. And then inside this rule is where we'll, for example, declare our color value. So now we may be like, hey, this is great. I'm writing Sass. Well, this kind of nesting isn't always cool because one of the biggest mistakes we can make is nest styles that do not need to be nested because it can produce really long selector chains and create lots of needless specificity in our selectors. We may think that it allows for better code organization, which it does in some cases, but really, lots of nesting equals bloat. Now, the good thing is that we originally wrote our CSS without any parent dependencies, so we don't really need to nest selectors here. So that's why I usually try to avoid nesting unless it makes sense, and I'll show you where it makes sense to nest rules in our project. So here in our base.scss partial, the first place where it might make sense to nest rules is down below in our link rules. So with Sass, we can reference the current parent selector in a nested rule using the ampersand symbol, as we saw in the previous video when we built that clearfix placeholder. So first, let's create a new rule that targets the A or anchor element. So we're going to type A followed by a set of curly braces. Then inside this rule, we're going to nest the rules for link, visited, and hover. I'm actually going to remove the active state from our project, but you can leave it in if you want. So I'm just going to delete active, and I'm going to go ahead and select and cut the link, visited, and hover rules, then paste them inside the new A rule. Let me clean things up a little bit. And now to reference the parent selector in this rule, we can replace the A selector in all the nested rules with the ampersand. And once we save and compile our Sass, let's open up our application.css file, so our CSS output. And when we scroll down, we can see how Sass outputs them as separate rules. So now you may be thinking, well, isn't that what we already had to begin with? Why did we have to rewrite everything just so we can output what we'd already written? And that is a valid point. Now, even though we're not nesting these rules to mimic any sort of HTML hierarchy or because there is a parent dependency, I still like to keep these related selectors nicely organized under one rule whenever possible. So in Sass, we can now use a parent selector to append a suffix to a selector. And this is especially useful when working with named spaced class selectors. So for instance, inside the components directory, we'll bring up the typography partial. And when we scroll down, we can see how we have classes with the name main heading and main titles. So we can actually nest rules under this main namespace, similar to how we defined our link rules. Now, this is just a simple example, but in a larger project, we may have a long list of namespaced rules, so we can make things a little more modular and maintainable with nesting. So first, I'm going to create a new rule with the class selector main. Then I'm going to select and cut the main title and main heading rules and paste them inside this new rule. Let me just move this down so we can see this a little better. And now we can replace the main classes in our nested rules with the ampersand. So first I'm going to replace main heading with ampersand heading. And right below that, I'm going to replace main in the main title class with an ampersand. All right, so now if we save and compile our Sass and bring up our output CSS, we can see how that ampersand selector sort of undoes the nesting in the Sass rules and outputs them as separate selectors without making them descendants of any selector, as we can see here. So remember, don't nest everything into everything just because you can, or don't just nest because it's a cool Sass thing to do. Only nest if it makes sense.